and welcome to Comically Pedantic, where we take a detailed look at the complicated concepts, characters, and history of comic book culture. I'm your host, Eric L. Chase, and joining me in this episode again is the wonderful Corinne Levy.
Hello!
Thank you.
No one can see it.
I
did a rainbow through
I enjoyed it.
my
Thank
little
you.
screen.
Thank you again for coming back. This has it's been a while since we've actually recorded the last episode, and
It's been a hot minute.
Yeah, we both had some crazy life things happen all at the same time. So I feel
Our lives were just like, let's have things happen together and separately.
I mean, they were good things.
Oh yeah,
but just enough to like upend our lives for a bit. And I feel bad too, because the last time we were supposed to record, I'm the one who texted you and was like, can we reschedule? And then it just never happened.
Let's reschedule for 3 months from
now. But this is why I didn't put out the other episodes when we recorded them, because I expected something to go wrong. And this is kind of like one big story. So it would be not the best idea to put out half of the story and then be like, all right, we'll check back in with you guys in a few months to tell you the rest of it.
It would have been like if The Sound of Music had an intermission that was 3 days long and you couldn't leave the theater. Like, you would just be trapped there.
Wait, speaking of like movies like that with little intermissions, I don't know about you. You've seen Fiddler on the Roof, right?
Yeah, I can't remember when I saw the movie. But I most recently saw a stage production of it. Which, what a time. Because let me tell you, the first half is very fun and pretty happy, and then it gets so depressing.
So I always tell people, the first time you watch it all the way through. Second time and moving forward, stop after the wedding. There's no point.
Stop after the pure bottle dancing at the wedding. That's all you need.
Yeah, you don't need what comes after. No. As long as you know what happened, that's fine. You don't have to put yourself through it every time.
No, just mourn the once.
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna do like a real quick, I guess, a little bit of a recap of what we talked about last time. We don't really necessarily need to go over Gamergate, but I think it would be worth talking about how ComicsGate started again, just so you kind of have it in your mind as we go through some of this.
Yeah, so if you want, do you want me to tell you what I remember?
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
Ooh, this is
going to be Corinne's Spark Note, its own mini section. So I remember a lot of like, I guess newer comics were coming out, and there was an era where like, the one thing that really stuck in my mind was there was an era when people found out that like Captain America was like a Nazi. Like that was a thing that came out. Yeah. And a lot of like, a lot of very like heavily, I guess, in your face political, I put in quotes, like comic books were coming out. Mm-hmm. That were not as cookie cutter as they used to be. And a lot of cis white men got really mad at that. I can't, some of their names were insane. Like these men's names, and I cannot remember them in particular, but they started going to like conventions and having like organizations to basically like make comic books straight white men again. To the point where they were like bullying people at conventions who were just trying to have like a nice adult conversation about like the state of comic books. Which then became a question of like, who should be at a convention? Like, who should be speaking? What topics should be happening? Like, should we be mentioning like political stuff and not? But basically, it's a movement on the internet of white men being angry about diversity that's happening because they're afraid of losing the stuff that they had.
Yeah.
and
So
that's what I remember.
a lot of it happened on Twitter, and you get people.
Yes.
Richard C. Meyer was
Oh, the last thing I remember
yeah.
is fuck Alex Jones. That's it.
So you get like people Richard C. Meyer who went on by for a long time by the name Comics and Diversity. You had Ethan Van Sciver, who was someone who worked for Marvel and DC. You had a bunch of people popping in and out. I'm not sure if we mentioned John Malin. John Malin pops up. Um,
Yes, we did.
they're just a lot of different people, some working in the industry and some not, who were
Mhm.
really pissed off about the fact that there was just this wave of comic books coming out that catered to non-white men, and they saw it as kind of an affront. It was this weird political thing to them, and yes, but also no. So what really kickstarted that whole trend of comic books coming out was Ms. Marvel. Um, that
Yes,
like
okay.
there had been some comic books out, before that really kind of shook the status quo up, but nothing compared to Ms. Marvel. That book sold out so many times. It has been reprinted probably 7 or 8 times by now, and it was a huge hit. And I remember I even did not pick up Ms. Marvel for a long time because I was like, oh, it's Marvel doing a character who is Muslim, and it's just a way to get people to read it. That was the general consensus online with some of the people that I had seen, and it was enough for me to be like, yeah, that's probably what happened because I'm a cynical person
Mhm.
for the most part. And it took me a few months after Ms. Marvel came out to go, I'll check it out. Maybe it's something that I'll like. And my God, it was my favorite book for the longest time. It is
Yeah, you
really
lent it
good.
to me.
It's so good. So that sold so well. Marvel decided we're gonna do this big initiative that's going
Mhm.
to shake up our landscape, and that we're going to have Sam Wilson's going to be Captain America, Jane is going to be Thor. We're going to really change gender and race quite a bit,
Yeah.
and that pissed off a lot of people online. um, and it didn't start just there because there were other books that came out that were pissing people off, but then that really got the ball rolling. And um it's it's hard to say it's just cis white men that were upset. It is a good majority of cis white men that,
Yeah.
but the actual ComicsGate movement is multifaceted, and it's weird because
Yeah.
if you were to really dig into the things that they said, it falls apart. But they were able to like convince enough people to go along with it, right?
Yeah. Also,
Um,
now that I'm thinking about it, so, like, also, I do have Ms. Marvel still in my house. I have comic books I have to give back to you, because I have
you're
finished
fine.
reading a bunch of them. But
Oh,
anyway,
good.
um, yeah. But now isn't, like, Miss Marvel and, like, the Thor: Love and Thunder, like, all of those are coming out based on, like, these comic books that people were getting upset about.
Yes.
So, like, do we think like, because I don't know. I'm not in touch with, like, as much comic book news as I should be. I only listen to, like, 1 podcast about it, like, 1 or 2. Um, so, like, is Comicsgate kind of, like, getting a little louder now that, like, that stuff is coming out? Or do you think because you're more up to date with it, has it kind of been at, like, a low tide now? Are
I'll
they
be
kinda
honest
just,
with
like,
you.
over it?
More recent Comicsgate stuff, I've not paid that much attention to because they've kind
Okay,
of put themselves into a weird little hole, and we'll get to how that happened over the
okay.
course of the next couple of episodes because there were a lot of ups and downs for a while. Um, but I mean, it is still going strong. Ethan Van Sciver does live streams all the time on YouTube where he just
Right.
bitches about comic books. Um, And in fact, I will say I haven't really seen much about like these shows other than people kind of complaining, but not to the extent that it was, or at least I haven't paid that close of attention to it the way it was when the
Right.
comics were coming out. Um,
Okay.
a lot more people I've seen are excited, or they're annoyed by like Thor not being like a Shakespearean drama and being more fun and comedic. You know what I mean? Uh,
Interesting.
Stuff like that. Because I mean,
Okay.
I like Thor both ways. It's whatever.
Yeah.
I do want to point out something. Recently, Ethan Van Sciver actually did tweet something that I wasn't going to necessarily fold into this show, but I thought it was worth commenting on since you kind of were talking about like where ComicsGate is now. And
Yeah.
I want to point out that I do think, and I could be wrong, I think what I'm about to read to you, these two tweets, are entirely meant to troll people and not necessarily like,
Meant to be
look,
taken that seriously.
I think there's a kernel of truth there, but I think the reason he's saying it is because it's like, haha, look, I pissed all these people off, and like that makes me feel
Um,
better. Um,
okay.
so the first tweet is Ethan Van Sciver said, Stan Lee knew how to properly utilize women in comics. They were there to keep the morale of the male characters up so they could be more effective. Marvel editors do this with their assistants too. By the way, this required only 25% of the cast to be female. It worked. That's the first tweet. The second tweet is Marvel is adding too many females to superhero teams. Stanley already established how many women to men is tolerable on a superhero team. He called it the fantastic ratio. For every 3 males, a maximum of 1 female. Moreover, Stan called her Invisible Girl. This is law. And that's what really
Can we
tipped it off
take a
to me.
moment? The maximum of one female? Like,
Yes.
what is less like, we just need a boob. We just
Yeah.
need a boob.
The last tweet is what really tipped it off to me about this being a trolling thing. The whole this is a law, and like the fact that he goes as far as to say he called her the invisible girl, like you're just trying to piss off people. And as far
It
as like
definitely sounds like an attempt of, like, creating a stand-up rant.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And to what you were saying earlier about like Comicsgate and like where they are now. So one of the editors that was harassed after posting a picture of herself like drinking a milkshake.
Oh,
Uh,
the milkshake ladies. I do remember them.
one of those editors posted a picture of her new haircut on like Instagram recently and had someone go on there to yell at her for being a fake gamer girl who is ruining comic or fake comic book and gamer girl who is ruining comics by like pretending to be a geek. And it was like you guys started this like 6-7 years ago, and you're still on this. This is still your thing.
Yeah.
It's just wild, and it's she's not hurting anyone. She's actually doing a very damn good job as an editor. They just don't
Yeah,
like
1,
her.
she's good at her job, and 2, I think they're really just jealous that they didn't take a cute photo with Milkshake.
Probably. All
Because
right,
I get pretty angry when I see my friends with milkshakes and I don't get one, like, I don't know.
I
That's what
totally
I'm thinking.
understand. I'm that way with coffee or tea. If I
Oh,
see someone with
yes.
coffee or tea, I'm like,
No, me too.
you didn't get me one.
A lemonade? I will kill a man for lemonade.
So, after years of growing harassment, provocation, and alt-right infiltration, Comicsgate staked its claim as the heir apparent to the Gamergate movement from just a short while prior. Arguing for apolitical storytelling while pushing for more right-wing creators, the movement quickly became an amalgamation of conflicting ideas that appealed to a broad base, often at odds with each other. That's why you ended up with people who weren't necessarily just white cis men, you know.
Right. Okay.
Uh, in our previous episode, we discussed the beginnings of the campaign and some of the major players involved, and we kind of just went over that now.
Mhm.
There's a lot more to discuss, and for this, I really want to start with um, going over the common refrains that they had, like the two main points that they had about comics, which were that comic book sales dropped drastically when social justice warriors began pushing their politics into the stories. And if that's true, we have to first look at, did comic book sales drop? And then
Mhm.
if they did, are those tied to politics? So that's what I want to really like, at least for the first half of this, I want to focus on that.
Right.
We're going to get into a little bit of stuff after, because I meant to write a very short piece at the end of this about,
Mhm.
we'll get to what it is, but I ended up finding someone who I now cannot stand as a person, and I ended up writing a lot about them. And I'd never heard of this person before, but holy shit, do I hate them now.
Oh,
All right.
no.
So, comic book sales have always been a tricky thing to unpack and largely based on estimates or pre orders. There are plenty of reasons for why this is the case, but it might be best to start with some of the numbers first. When talking to most in the industry, the common consensus is that there has been a very steady decline for quite a number of years. In 1966, part of the golden age of comics, the highest selling comic series was Batman with an average of 898,470 copies sold, like per issue. Like that was the average for them in 1966.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
by contrast, the highest selling comic book for 2016, which the reason I'm using 2016 is because that's around the time that ComicsGate was really starting. So I really
Yeah,
wanted
that was
to,
kinda like the incline of it.
right. So the highest selling comic book for 2016 was Boom's Big Trouble in Little China / Escape from New York #1, which was helped immensely by large sales directly to a repackager and topped out at an estimated 421,627 or 625, sorry, issues sold. That drop was over 476,000 sales per month, meaning a loss of over 50% of total sales. And that's fairly indicative of what the comic book industry has looked like as years have gone on.
Mhm.
But that's not the entire story. If you just take that, it's like, oh, yeah, we're selling way less than we were in the 60s. Um, but there's a huge amount of extra stuff that needs to be looked into.
'Cause that
So
was just comparing the most sold of one thing, like, these were the 2 of
the
each of
highest
those
selling,
years.
right?
Because I'm thinking of it, like, if you're just comparing those 2, like, my guess now is that there's so much more content. So, like, if everybody is buying, like, such a crazy variety of content compared to when you just had maybe, like, your main guys.
Right. So
Yeah, that's my guess.
you hit on a good chunk of it. And then we're going to get over because it's this is difficult to unpack for a lot of reasons. So we're
Mhm.
going to go through like sort of step by step as to um why sales look the way they do now. But one of the big things is you're right. It used to be you basically had Marvel and you had DC. So you had Batman, you had Spider-Man, stuff like that. Now there are so many different companies and a lot of indie books too. And
Yeah.
you're going to split the audience. And especially like, okay, we'll get into it because there's
Yeah,
it,
whatever order you want, it's
there's
fine.
there's no, you're fine. There's more to just the split between Marvel and DC too, because it gets a little bit more complicated. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting. I for anyone that is like listening at home and they are interested in sort of like the history of comic books and how they got to where they are and a lot of these weird little like trivia things, I cannot recommend a book higher than uh I think it was called, oh man, now I'm gonna screw the name up. It is Marvel Comics The
This is what
Untold Story.
editing's for.
Right. I'm not even going to edit it. Marvel Comics The Untold Story. It is wonderful. I have it on audiobook and I also have it as a digital copy. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Full of amazing stories from like the 30s on. It's crazy.
Cool.
So one of the things also to look into this with is the cost of comic books. So in 1966, the median cost for a comic book was 12 cents, meaning that the Batman comic would bring in over 178 or sorry, wow, I'm bad at numbers. Would bring the meaning the Batman comic would bring in over $107,800. And with inflation, that means that DC would have just over $799,600 per issue in 2016 if the sales were the exact same, right?
Right.
The difference is that the comic book prices rose dramatically. In 2016, the median cost for a comic book was $3.99. So that Big Trouble in Little China / Escape from New York #1, that comic would bring in over $1.5 million with the amount that it sold.
I
So
was
that,
just about to say, if I could get a comic book now for 12 cents,
yeah. Oh,
like, the stores would be empty.
I have to tell you though, when St. Mark's Comic Shop was uh in St. Mark's, it closed for a while
Right,
and they moved. But when it was in St. Mark's, I used to go on the weekends and they had like a 50-cent bin. And that's how I got most of my Doom 2099 books. Because no
right.
one gave a shit about Doom 2099. It's a fantastic series that was just wild series. Um,
Mhm.
but that's I went through and I would just be like, what can I get for 50 cents? And I would just pick out random stuff. And usually it was older things, but they were so much
Yeah.
fun. And I miss doing that. So
Like, I had to limit myself the other day. I was like, "Alright, I can only get, like, 3 because they're each $4." Like, man,
oh
I'm upset.
when we went out for free comic book day, I ended up spending
Mhm.
so much money.
No, same.
I I bought, I mean, some of that was I bought like prints. I bought some like indie books. Thankfully a couple of the artists gave me some free stuff cuz otherwise I would have left entirely broke.
Yeah. I made
And
everybody draw me a cat, and that was fun. They had a
I
great time. They were really excited about it.
I picked up a Mandalorian poster from Fabio Redivo, and a wonderful man that he is, he gave it to me for free. So
Oh,
if
wow.
anyone sees Fabio out there, just support him, please. He's a wonderful human.
Yeah. Claps for
Um,
that man.
so the comparison between these two comic books, it's not quite fair. Since, as mentioned before, the comic book was sold to a repackager, so that helped the sales that um, the Big Trouble in Little China / Escape from New York.
Right.
So if we really want to like take it a look at the differences here, we should look at Batman, right? So Batman was the first example. So let's look at the same Batman book, but in 2016. So
Okay.
in 2016, Batman sold for $2.99 and topped out at 304,245 issues sold. So that brings in $909,692 for that particular issue. Um, so while the sales have dropped as years have gone on, the major two companies are technically bringing in way more money than they ever were before. So
Right.
the major comic book companies could accept this and take the extra that they're making from the price jump. But if the numbers show anything, it's that there is an untapped market. Losing half of your readership would mean losing half of your potential profits. And obviously, the big two, Marvel and DC, have their movies to fall back on and make what they can from the billion-dollar box offices. But that's not all that they did. Comic book companies began collecting their stories and publishing them as trade paperbacks. So, as manga grew in popularity within the United States, the compact collections of American comics for a slightly cheaper price than buying the individual issues also rose. So, by
Yeah.
2020, trade paperbacks, graphic novels, and manga accounted for $835 million in sales. So, this put these collections at just over 65% of the overall sales for comics. So, if you're actually looking at how comic books are sold now, most of it's not going to be single issues. It's people going out and buying the collection, like that Ms. Marvel book I gave you. I'm
Yeah.
why like unless you're going weekly or monthly to a comic book store to pick up a single issue, it makes way more sense to go and just buy the collected paperback.
And it
You get the full
honestly, it
story.
makes it such a better community 'Cause it's
Right.
before I even knew about the books, I always thought that it was like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna have to, like, search through these bins for issue 1 of anything to see if I even want it."
Right.
And, like, sometimes I still do that, like, that's what I did for, Birds of Prey, which are the issues that I just got at that other comic book store. So, like, thankfully, like, that worked out in that situation when it's like you don't wanna flash a lot of cash, but, like, you get lucky and you do find an issue 1 of something.
Mhm.
Um, or, like, the issues are great for when you're addicted to something like me and it's finally coming out. So I have been buying the individual issues of Saga, but, like, it's because I'm an impatient bitch. So I can't wait for a book.
Whereas
Um,
I'm a little bit more of someone who I it's so difficult for me to go out of my way to get to a comic book store anymore. It's like a special event when I go. And I usually spend a lot of
yeah,
money on just random books so that I can try out stuff. So I do a
yeah,
lot of
that's
reading
probably
online.
honestly the better way to be. Um, I think that's what I'm trying to shift more towards because I really do appreciate the books. Once it's like I have it, I'm like, "Great." I do have at least, like, a full story or, like,
Mhm.
mostly the compendiums honestly can be too expensive sometimes, like, that's why the books I feel like are the best because it's like I get, like, a good meal out of it, and then I can figure out if I wanna keep coming back to the meal. Um, so definitely trying to shift more towards book purchases, and again, they're really great, like because you can just start. Like, it's not as gatekeepy as it used to be when it's, like, again, searching and, like, huffing and puffing over bins. So,
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, what one of the when I went to the comic book store, not this last time, but the time prior, I ended up walking
Mhm.
out with a random issue of the Power Rangers, like Sonic the Hedgehog. I got an old copy of Strangers in Paradise. I actually think the one that you have currently.
Oh, cool.
And,
Yeah, yeah.
and something else too. I just picked up a bunch of stuff and I loved every single one of them. So from there, like I went back, I reread the Power Rangers comics that told the specific story that I was reading, which
Mhm.
then turned into they had two series. So then I went and read the other series as well. Sonic the Hedgehog, I went down a rabbit hole for a long period.
You really did.
Oh, I'm still there, but
I
like
was there for the beginning of it, and it was really fun to watch.
comic book wise, I spent so much time reading that because they did a year-long story arc in Sonic the Hedgehog that was basically a zombie story, and it was so good.
Oh.
It was like a metal virus. So like if you get infected with it, you turn into like basically like a robot but evil. They call them zombots in
Oh,
the thing, and
that's fun.
it literally takes over the world, and you watch them all fail until like the final issue where they like fix it. But it's like
Right.
it it is heartbreaking to read. It is so good.
Oh
It
my
is one of the
god.
first time I've actually cared about people turning into zombies. I was like, oh no, every
Did you ever
time.
think you'd become emotionally distraught by Sonic? Like,
I
ever in your life?
No, I mean, not when I was a kid anyway. Like I started reading some of the like Archie Sonic comics like many years ago, and they were really good. I didn't get that invested into them. There
I
was
didn't
something.
realize there was an Archie and Sonic crossover, but that's
Well,
amazing.
this is probably going to end up being another episode, but just so you know, Archie Comics used to publish Sonic the Hedgehog, and it was the like longest running Sonic the
I
Hedgehog.
hope I'm here for that episode. That would be so fun.
I will absolutely have you on because the reason Archie doesn't publish it now is insane. It is
Oh my god. I
it
wanna
it
know.
it
I
was
wanna know
I
all the Sonic tea.
I can boil it down really quickly and we'll get into it in another episode. But basically, there was a writer who wrote for the series for a very long time. He came up with a lot of random characters that were essentially Knuckles but old, Knuckles but a girl, Knuckles but like from another universe, Sonic but green, Sonic but like old, just things like that, right?
Yeah.
And he got really mad about a comic book coming out, and due to like fuck ups on everyone's end, Sega, Archie, and this writer, it turns out there were a lot of legal issues over who actually owned those characters. So he sued both Archie and Sega over after he like copyrighted like 200 characters. And
Amazing.
again, the majority of these are just like Sonic but green. Like, you know what I mean? Like
It's so good.
nothing. You're right. So then they got into a big legal battle and they had to get rid of all of these characters. And then it just like I at that point, the Archie kind of like screwed up their relationship with Sega. So Sega said, "We're pulling our license. You cannot keep our character anymore." And then they gave it
Right.
to another company. Now the good news is when they gave it to the other company, they brought along pretty much the entire team that was working on it at that point. Um,
Oh, great.
so it's the quality stayed up. I I started with issue number 1. It's great. I highly recommend it. And then
Cool.
somewhere around like like issue 12 or 15, like the metal virus thing starts, and it went on for over a year. It's really good.
Awesome.
I'm
One
completely
day,
off topic
I'll have
though.
to get to it.
So
Yeah, true. Sorry. We'll segue
um
back.
in modern days, readers are far more likely to purchase a trade paperback or a graphic novel with a complete story, like you and I were talking about, rather than pick up a single
Yes.
issue of a storyline. In
We want the whole
1966,
Sonic robot story.
right? And that
Yeah.
makes sense. You want to get that. You don't want to go and pick up a random issue in the middle of that story and be like, "What the hell is going on? Why is everyone dead?" you know,
Yeah. We
you want to
found a way to connect it. It's fine.
right. In 1966, customers could buy an issue of Batman and get a short but complete story. And this practice
Right.
is nearly non-existent in the modern decompressed storytelling practice in most comic books. You don't really get you pick up a single issue, you get one story, you get part of a bigger story.
Mhm.
So the readership didn't really abandon comics. They followed the easiest path to get a full story. And that in turn means that like it's not just oh, Batman issues are not selling really well. It's me, maybe they're not selling as much as they used to, but you can go and pick up Batman Year One and you have the
Yeah.
entire story. And single issues are still thriving. It's just not in print. Digital sales have been on the rise in most recent years, and with both DC and Marvel offering fairly expansive archives on a subscription model, huge numbers of fans are reading old and new books alike for a far cheaper cost than ever before. That's how I read most of my books now. I have a subscription to both DC and Marvel, and I read
Oh, okay.
every night. I pick up like just a new book I want to read, not necessarily a new one. Sometimes I go back to a bunch of old ones, and I'll read. I've read every X-Men comic book from their inception to I think I'm in 1998 at the moment.
Oh,
And
wow.
I could only do that with having this subscription and then also illegally downloading some. But
But we won't tell anybody.
I only illegally downloaded them because they didn't have them in the archives yet. But some
Yeah.
of them they do. Um, as the COVID-19 pandemic took effect and more people were stuck in their homes, digital comic book sales rose by 33%. So what we see isn't an industry that's dying, we see an industry that's thriving.
Yeah,
So
it's just
and
evolving.
right. In 1996, North American sales were around 300 to 320 million dollars, right? By the early 2000s, this figure rose up to $400 million. By 2010, it was $700 million. By 2015, this jumped to $900 million. And by 2019, they topped over $1 billion per year in North America alone. So
Mhm.
the dying industry myth only sticks around due to the change in the structure of the business. No one's paying attention to like how it actually works. And if you go by outdated ways of looking at it, you're looking at only part of the information.
Yeah, it seems like they almost looked at, like, one very small, vague infographic and just, like, really stuck to it. They didn't actually it seems like not a lot of research was really done, and maybe, like, because they didn't want to you know,
Well,
prove
and some of it
themselves
is
wrong or whatever.
some of it's difficult too. It's hard to really get into like, oh, how did things change? It's not necessarily your first thought. You look at sales, right? And then you're like, oh, look, it went down. Um,
Yeah.
and it's a little I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt. But at this point, like they have all of this information. There's no reason to not know this, right?
Right.
There are some I've seen some of them post like, oh look, this comic book sold really well for one issue, and then the next issue it dropped by however many. And you have to also keep in mind, I didn't add this in here, but in the 90s there was a huge boom in comic book sales, but because people thought, hey, the next Spider-Man #1 or whatever is going to sell for millions of dollars because that's what they did in the 60s. You bought this old, but it's not the same because it's hard to find those ones from the 60s. Um,
Yeah.
but you still have some of that mentality where people go out and they buy #1s and that's it. They might just pick up the digital. Like I am a big fan of the comic book series Marauders.
Yeah.
I did not pick up the first issue, but I did go out and pick up the issue where Kitty Pryde finally kissed a woman for the first time because I wanted to physically own that one. But
Yeah.
I read the book just digitally after that. So my like how like $4 went to the print sales of that, and that's not it doesn't really affect anything else that I was still reading the series after that. It just
Right.
doesn't show it, right? Um and at one point comics were found at newspaper stands alongside more mainstream magazines. That's the other thing that needs to be really drilled home here. How a
Yeah.
comic book actually made it to consumers was a major driver of how a company would operate. So, Timely, Marvel's predecessor, they had a limit to their entire line in the 50s because the only distributor that they could use was owned by DC. So if
Mm.
they publish a comic book, it had to go through DC Comics. Uh,
Yeah.
So if Timely wanted to produce any more than 8 titles per month, they had to find a way to distribute their comics without losing money, which turned out to be unattainable. So Stan Lee was forced to decimate his staff in order to keep everything operating. For any company that wanted to remain relevant or attempt expansion, proper distribution was the key. So, in the early days of comic book distribution, these magazines were sold on a returnable basis, meaning that unsold copies would be resold back to the publisher at no loss to the newsstand. So, you buy 100 issues of whatever comic book, right? And
Yeah.
you only sell 20, you can return those 80 and get a refund for it. Uh,
Oh,
that's
okay.
that's how it used to work. And a
Yeah.
lot rumors swirled of comics sitting in warehouses, and because of damaged copies were still allowed to be returned, a lot of comics had their covers ripped off and returned for credit, while the damaged comics sold at reduced prices, allowing the distributors to make quite a bit of extra profit. You can get money back for your
Um,
comic book if you return the cover, but then you can sell it for a slightly cheaper cost to your customer base, and you basically make double the profit. So
right.
what ended up usually happening were 2 or 3 copies were printed for every comic book that was sold. So if that's taken into consideration, that means the Batman comic that sold for 898,470 issues probably had a print run in the like almost 2 million copies just so that it could
Right.
sell that many issues. That means that comics were definitely selling, but the cost of production was massive. And that
Mhm.
clearly had to cut into their profits. I mean, sure, like cost of production now is also really high, but like you're not printing 2 million issues of a book to sell less than half of that.
Yeah.
That's bonkers that's how that ever worked.
It's almost
It's
like looking at the original stat that we were given to kind of, like, almost, like, debunk, I guess, is, like, if
Mhm.
you Googled somebody's net worth. Like, because like,
Right.
when you look up, like, Anthony Bourdain's net worth,
Mhm.
like, that's not really what it is. They're not, like, taking into account all of, like, his costs, you know?
And
So,
it's
it's
also
interesting.
like Along those lines, like Elon Musk, people were talking about like how his net worth dropped so much. That's because when people calculate his net worth, they're calculating it based on the shares that he owns in Tesla. And if he's like, if Tesla stock plummets, his net worth plummets. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's still incredibly rich, and like fuck him anyway. But like,
Yeah.
it's 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 an imaginary number at this point, you know? And that's kind of what this like the sales of these comic books, it's wild to think that like you could run a business this way.
It's really crazy.
um And as like comic stores popped up around the country, many of those store owners began arguing for better deals. And since the erratic newsstand distribution was hurting readership, because if you think about it, like, oh, I got X-Men number 52 this month. I probably won't get it next month. That's gonna hurt. Like people aren't gonna want to pick it up because they want to be able
Yeah,
to
because it's
find
not guaranteed that, like, I don't know, if you're in New York or something, like, the newsstand on, like, 82nd Street might not have X-Men every single week. Like, it might go from X-Men to then, like, I don't know, like, the Green Lantern or something, and, like, who
right,
knows when the X-Men will ever come back to that newsstand. So,
right. And so
crazy.
that meant that there needed to be like a better cooperation between comic book stores and comic publishers. So the rise
Mhm.
in a distribution network for direct market sales to comic stores meant more space for small print runs and a huge influx of creators working for a far more stable industry. And there are plenty of areas where comic book distribution can and should be critiqued. But finding a way to stabilize a volatile market is an important and impressive move. In the
Yeah.
1960s, it was not the norm for every issue of a comic book to come out monthly. Today, it is odd to see a book that doesn't follow that path of publishing. It's weird if it's like, oh, we're printing out like one issue this month, and then maybe in a couple of months we're going to do it. That's considered way outside the norm. But that used to be the
Right.
way it like, when Marvel was going through DC, you would have, oh, this month we're going to do Journey into Mystery, uh we're going to do Amazing Fantasy, we're going to do like Captain America, next month we'll do whatever. And the reason you had books like Journey into Misery or Amazing Fantasy was because
Mhm.
you could pack different selling characters together and
Right.
sell them. That way you didn't have to have like let's say we go with DC. You didn't have to have a Green Lantern book and a Green Arrow book. You could do Green Lantern, Green Arrow together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the Green Book.
Right. Uh so the argument that sales are dropping across the board and the industry is tanking is, I think, demonstrably not true. We've just gone over the numbers. We've talked about distribution. It's wild that you could think that this industry is failing.
Yeah, the most accurate thing you could say is just, like, it's just different. Like, the
Right.
way that comics are sold is just significantly different.
Right.
Yeah.
So, uh, the other main argument often made is that comics have become too political. And in fact, this specific claim is what usually precedes the argument that sales have dropped or that the industry is failing. While we've already discussed how this doesn't really match with the actual sales figures and how diversity books were being handled the same way as any other, including how some outsold their white male counterparts, it's still important to discuss the politics in comics. And this is a part that I am very passionate about. Um, Starting all the way back in the 30s, mainstream superhero books told stories of upstanding citizens willing to help those that are in need. And at this
Mhm.
time, comics weren't a very profitable or impressive endeavor. Still in their infancy, comedic short stories and pulp adventures like Tarzan or Flash Gordon, those were the big hits of the time. And often, this new medium of storytelling employed out of work veterans or young graduates who had trouble finding paying gigs anywhere else. So it's no
Right.
wonder that some of the underserved in society, like, say, the Jewish community, ended up taking these jobs and working hard at pumping out as many pages as they could for the little money that they could actually make. So, after
Right.
all, this was America in the middle of the Great Depression. So, any money was considered good money. The runaway
Mhm.
success of Superman at this time spawned loads of superhero crime fighters in their own colorful gear. with working class, often fairly poor artists taking up shop in what was largely considered a lesser job compared to more high art magazine work. The push for stories that actually mattered or made a statement started fairly soon after that. Um, and it's like it's hard to really impress upon people just how important it is that you pretty much had Jewish and Italian Americans working on comic books. And this
Yeah.
is right before World War II. So there's a lot going through their minds as they're working on these books.
Yeah, there's a
Uh,
lot of weight to the stories. They just put really bright colors in front of it,
right. And again,
basically.
they're meant to be like pulp stories. They're not like
Yeah.
they weren't going in and trying to do a manifesto of anything, but they still were able to work things in. Um, at the onset of World War II, many Americans were still unsure of entering into another bloody war, understandably. In the pages
Yeah.
of comics, this was handled by characters like the Submariner or the Human Torch, the original Human Torch, fighting against
Mhm.
Nazis sporadically, like kind of randomly. They would beat up Nazis. While
Yeah.
DC characters like Superman and Batman focused on bank robbers and aliens. That's like they just decided to stay out of it because they were like, it's too political of an issue for us to touch. Um,
Right.
this changed as time went on and more countries began to fall to Hitler. So the Jews that made up the comic book publishers at the time were understandably very nervous. And that's when Joe Simon and Jack Kirby published Captain America #1 in December of 1940. They
Mhm.
gambled that having their hero clad in American stars and stripes punching Hitler on the cover would resonate with anxious readers, and it absolutely did. Nearly reaching the heights of Superman's debut, Captain America exceeded everyone's expectations and set the stage for many more wartime comics. And this is something that I don't think many people really focus on. You'll hear people say, oh, Captain America punched Hitler on the cover of his first issue, and they kind of leave it there. That's not all that happened. That
Right.
set the stage for a ton of political, specifically like propagandic, patriotic heroes to then become the norm.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think I mentioned it last episode.
mhm,
Um, but it's like even when it was like just kind of topical like changes.
mhm.
Like I what again, the first I really think I said it in the last episode. So sorry to the audience if I'm repeating, but I
It's
read
been a while for
Scarlet
us to
Witch.
record.
Yeah. But I did read like the full 12 issue Scarlet Witch and or Vision and Scarlet Witch, and there is a whole issue
Mhm.
where they talk about the creation of Martin Luther King Day and like how people feel about it. And like, I want to go grab the issue so bad because it's like, I just want to be like, it's here, it's real. Um, but like, yeah, that would have 100% been a very outright political move of like them talking about like, oh, should we even be fighting crime on Martin Luther King Day? And like, this is my holiday, like things like that.
Yeah.
Like that's, like after World War II of like Captain America punching Hitler and like it's still happening. Like it goes throughout all of the decades.
There's it starts very early on and it just kind of rolls in different directions. So like while men were sent to fight in the war, many women filled the creative roles behind the scenes of the comic book world and set the stage for empowered female superheroes. So you start with like Captain America and all that stuff, and then most of the men get shipped off, and a lot of women come in to help write, and that's when you get the pervasive like uh
Is that like
the
when
per-
Wonder Woman like comes in?
right. So you
Okay,
get
cool. I got a thing right.
the pervasive sexism of the time still existed. However, like so the characters weren't necessarily published on the covers or were drawn into very scantily clad outfits. Like that's a thing. But superheroes were slowly playing a role in the feminist movement. Throughout the 40s, the dominant readership of comic books were women. So it is no surprise to see Miss Fury, Phantoma, Sheena, and other female superheroes begin to take form. The most enduring, though, would of course be the feminist icon herself, Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
So after Professor William Marston commented on the untapped potential for education in comic books in an issue of Family Circle, he landed a consulting position at DC. In his new role, and with the help of his wife and his girlfriend, Marston created the Amazonian Wonder Woman as a strong role model for young girls. Like, he went into it with that in mind. And there's a lot of evidence that both his wife and his girlfriend helped him uh, like sculpt Wonder Woman as a character.
Right.
And she was largely based on both of them too. Um,
Mhm.
so becoming a near instant hit, Wonder Woman remained a mainstay at DC and considered part of the Trinity alongside Superman and Batman. By 1972, her role as a feminist icon was so well established that Ms. Magazine cemented the idea by featuring the comic book character. Publisher Gloria Steinem went so far as to say Wonder Woman symbolized many of the feminist values they were trying to introduce into mainstream culture,
Oh, I
which,
like that Gloria pops up.
right.
She's just got some cool life stories. I find her so fascinating.
So even beyond comic book history's early years, these political messages kept coming. By the 60s, several books took on political themes at their core. The X-Men, often argued to be created in response to both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, although I would say that's not necessarily true. It's just it kind of became that. But like in the
Okay.
original idea, it wasn't that. They took on the role of civil rights activists. That's what the X-Men were. They donned
Okay.
superhero costumes and they fought for social justice, becoming literal embodiments of social justice warriors. So,
And now, like, also, am I wrong in this? Because I remember it being like a conversation, but like Magneto, isn't his backstory that like I know in the movies, which I'm more familiar with, like he is like a survivor of like the Holocaust. Is
yes.
that what he also is in the comic?
Yes. So I think
Okay.
actually
So
I think
even
when you
still political.
right. When you came over for Passover, I think we ended up talking about that a little bit. Cuz I actually got while we were having our little Seder, I went to check the mail and I had my copy of like Jews and American comics to just arrived.
That's
um,
perfect timing.
yeah.
Passover and Jewish superhero.
Right. So while the early X-Men comic books, they like kind of stumbled in conveying the message of like social justice, they were firmly established as fighting for equal rights. Like that was the whole point of them. At the same
Yeah.
time, Marvel reintroduced Captain America to a world that lost like much of its interest in patriotism. A new jaded America was no longer interested in comic book characters waving the American flag, which is part of what informed Captain America's run moving forward. No longer would he blindly represent America. He would stand for what America could be. The timing couldn't have been any better considering the return coincided with the assassination of JFK.
Mhm.
American readers entered a new world, one no longer entirely focused on what they had known before. It became clear that having an America centric output limited market appeal. To combat this, Marvel sought out a chance to reinvigorate the X Men line by replacing the characters with multi ethnic, multinational newcomers. These new X Men actually embody the exact thing ComicsGate claimed was ruining comic books in modern days. No longer was the mutant team full of largely straight white men. Now the team claimed an African goddess, a Native American, a Japanese superhero, all within their ranks. And this new team and the creative decision of Chris Claremont, like the X-Men steadily became Marvel's best-selling book over the next few decades. By 1992, they ended up publishing the number one sold, like most sold comic book of all time. Like
Oh, cool.
that's how the X-Men got to where they were. It started with, hey, what if we got rid of all these white guys and we got like, we'll have mostly white guys, but we'll have other people in there too. And it was just
Yeah.
so wildly different and interesting that it grew over the years into becoming a juggernaut. And they weren't selling that well beforehand. It's
Right.
a weird thing that people are always like, oh, the X-Men, they're oversold or whatever. When they first came out, no one bought the X-Men. There's a
Yeah.
long stretch in their early run where they just reprinted earlier issues as the next issue. Like, that's what they
Oh,
did. Because no one was buying it. Um,
yeah.
so around that same time, Captain America's role as the model for an idealized America took a turn after the Watergate scandal. So
Oh, okay.
the writer of the book, Steve Englehart, felt the perfect opportunity to capitalize on the changing political landscape would be to play on Watergate as much as possible. The real life committee for the reelection of the president, which again, real life committee named the Committee for the Reelection of the President, which is abbreviated as CREEP, became the Committee to Regain America's Principles in the comics. So the Committee to Regain America's Principles would be abbreviated as CRAP. So Captain America sought out a criminal conspiracy known as the Secret Empire, only to find President Nixon behind the entire thing. And disgraced, Nixon committed suicide in front of the Sentinel of Liberty. The fallout of this event even led to Captain America abandoning his red, white, and blue attire in favor of a darker costume and changing his name to Nomad, as he was now a man without a country. So you have another huge example of like how comic
Yeah, that's
books
pretty,
will
like, blatantly
right.
political. There's, like, no there's no, like, symbolism in that. That's just
Yeah.
painfully
So
in your face.
and that's like that's the way it used to be. And it's like
Yeah,
people complain like, oh, I'm fine with politics, but you're just making it too obvious. I'm like, you have not read older comics then.
yeah,
That's it was wildly obvious at the time. Or you just were young and you didn't think about it. That's the
right.
other thing. Um So while Stan Lee always felt comfortable calling out bigotry, as he often did this in his own columns for Marvel, he often felt less comfortable speaking out on other political issues. When called out for lack of representation of black characters in their comics, Marvel quickly pointed out that the few that they did have were like innovative, but um, that wasn't enough. And they knew that. So they immediately started getting to work to create new ones. The Black
Mhm.
Panther's entire existence is a political statement, as is a great deal of other minority characters. Their role in the story shows that their existence is valid, specifically as it relates to a medium where straight white men were often the default, to the point that the existence of a minority character by 2016 was seen as a threat to their fragile identities. The
Yeah,
lack of real diversity in comics was even commented on within the pages of Green Lantern over at DC. This new and iconic run on the title took the somewhat novel approach of teaming a largely establishment and conservative character like Green Lantern with the leftist underdog of Green Arrow. In their first adventure together, a black man scolds Green Lantern for his lack of response to all of the black people it had gone through, with the hero unable to find a response. From there, the series tackled many political issues, with the two white stars often bickering about proper solutions. And I like it's outdated, but it's still a wonderful read if you ever like get a chance to go through and read Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Um,
right.
because the idea behind it was you would have these two heroes both coming from like very different perspectives but trying to do the right thing. So you would have a conservative and a leftist approaching the same issue and trying to see like what works best. And it was really
Yeah.
interesting. I very much liked it. And so, like, as the years went on, comics tackled political position after political position. The Punisher, a paranoid and dangerous war veteran, popped into comics as a critique of violent vigilantism, at the same time as several villains who made their names by selling out their left wing compatriots. Spider Man tackled drug abuse at the behest of the US Department of Health. Ms. Marvel's
Mhm.
creation came from a marketing strategy to chase the feminist audience. All of this happened in mainstream superhero books, which was nothing compared to the underground comics that dealt with drug use, sexuality, and other countercultural topics. There's literally
Yeah.
a comic book that was published called Abortion Comics, and it was about abortion and why it was like the different stories that could come from needing one, having one, or choosing not even to have one. Like
Oh, wow. When did that come out?
the 70s. It
The
like
'70s. Cool.
yeah, it's a massive industry with people making political statements all over the board. So like the argument about heavy-handed messages in modern comics compared to previous years is so tone deaf. I can't even understand it.
Yeah.
Like, it's certainly there have been good and bad issues of political like comics. And there have been countless examples of pushback throughout the years, but perhaps the most notable for the mainstream audiences is going to be Stan Lee's own words printed in modern comics.
Okay.
So, Stan's Soapbox was a column that ran from the 60s up to 2001. It was a place for Stan Lee to say whatever was on his mind. Often these amounted to general musings. Sometimes it was just like, hey, checking in. I'm Stan Lee. Go buy my comics. Like,
Cool.
and he would just write whatever was on his mind.
Yeah.
Occasionally, though, he would dip into much heavier topics, and specifically on the topic of bigotry. Like, he found it necessary to respond to criticism very rarely, but in an issue of The Avengers in 1970, Lee wrote this, quote, "From time to time, we receive letters from readers who wonder why there's so much moralizing in our mags. They take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more. But somehow, I can't see it that way. It seems to me that a story without a message, however subliminal, is like a man without a soul. In fact, even the most escapist literature of all, old time fairy tales and heroic legends, contained moral and philosophical points of view. At every college campus where I may speak, there's as much discussion of war and peace, civil rights, and the so-called youth rebellion as there is of our Marvel mags per se. None of us live in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events around us. Even events which shape our stories just as they shape our lives. Sure, our tales can be called escapist, but just because something's for fun doesn't mean we have to blanket our brains as we read it." And
I
I
think that's a
love
good
that.
quote.
It's so nice.
Yeah.
And
Oh, good job, Stanley.
Marvel has like republished this throughout the years, especially like after Stan died. They were for a long time just posting like random Stan soapboxes in comics, and
Right.
this is one of them. I love Stan was not a perfect man, but
No.
he definitely had a good heart. And
I think that's what makes him great. Because it's like, I don't know. When I think of Stanley, I do think that he was, like, a great ally in the sense that, like, he was just trying his best. And,
yeah.
like, he knew that, like, people need to be treated equally, like, no matter what, and,
Mhm.
like, sure. He was also, like, I don't know, like, the 70s or 80s? He was old. Like, I think people need to remember that he was an old human being when he was, like, when he was finished.
It's
But,
also
like
important to know that like
but he tried.
during the time that like Marvel was being published through a distributor run by DC Comics, um Stan had to like fire most of his staff.
Yeah.
So there is going to be a point where he is going to make some very tough business decisions, in part because like that's got to be rough, telling so
Yeah.
much of your staff like, I can't afford to pay you. I don't know where you're going to get work. I'm sorry. That's got to be, and that's going to play a big part in how you approach making maybe not the best business decisions moving forward, but business decisions that like are going to keep the train going.
Yeah.
It's not saying that like what he did was right, but just saying like I understand some of the decisions that he made, you know?
Yeah.
um
What I appreciate is, like, especially from that quote, is, like, he really understands that, like, writers are meant to write how they feel, and that's how you get the best work out of them.
mhm,
Like, not that, like, some stories might not end up being arbitrarily good, you know? Some
right.
are still gonna come out rough, but all in all, like, Marvel is successful, and it's because the people are creating what they feel and what they're passionate about, and a lot of times what you're passionate about is what, like, drives your life, which ends up usually being political in some way. So,
Yeah,
there you go.
what he underscores throughout what he said is that every story is political. There is no way to separate politics from storytelling. The traditional tales that Comicsgate wants to get back to, like, tell a political story in their own right. A white male hero standing up to those around him may seem without a message, but that's because the message is so often used and saturated that it's overlooked. The choice to exclude a minority character or sideline them is inherent in the choice to use a white cishet male. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
that there is anything wrong with the choice on its own. Like, you can have white cishet male characters, but when seen next to the hundreds of other characters using the same exact approach, it becomes apparent how little minorities are prioritized. They are seen
Yeah.
as a bother rather than a person. It's dehumanizing. The people that these characters represent, it's telling them that they need to stay in their place. Um, and that's one of the things, like, I talk about in my the episode I did on fridging. It, like, the percentage of female characters in
Mhm.
comics and how often female characters are treated poorly, it is
Yeah.
wildly disproportionate. And that's the problem. It's not that you are, like, treating a female character poorly, it's that it's so heavily on one side.
It's dangerous when it definitely becomes a motif. Like,
Right. Uh it's everyone should just think a little bit more about their choices. And
yeah.
that's tough. I understand. It is tough and everyone makes mistakes, but then just maybe don't harass random women online because you didn't think about something.
Mhm.
Um, the act of remaining silent or refusing to change when faced with the lack of representation or even outright bigotry, that's a political statement. Like, the act to not do something is a political statement. It is a tacit approval of the issues that it ignores. This is the underlying principle to the story of Peter Parker becoming Spider Man. When Peter refused to stop a criminal, he made a choice to remain neutral during an injustice. When his uncle was murdered by the same criminal he refused to stop, Peter learned the consequences of his inaction and adopted the mantra, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Stan Lee had been making this point for decades before Comicsgate argued that comics had become too political. In
Right.
reality, politics had always been there, but the advent of social media allowed hundreds of people to feel power in their anger and harassment of others. This is the same playbook adopted by Gamergate and a truly effective way to convince those highly invested in a topic of being co opted for nefarious purposes to throw support behind a catchphrase that masks a harassment campaign. That's why they're the same. The the online arguments during this time, like, it's easy to say, like, oh, hey, this happened on Twitter. No one cares about Twitter.
Yeah.
That's not true. Like, you live part of your life online now, right? And that also did not go unnoticed by Marvel.
Right.
So they had been the subject of attack from Comicsgate from the very beginning. Joe Quesada, then the chief creative officer at Marvel Comics, tweeted the same Stan soapbox that I referenced earlier, the one that we just spent, like, however long talking about.
Yeah.
Um, he tweeted that out and referenced it by saying, "Breaking news, this just in from 1970?" question mark. So Quesada's reaction to Comicsgate, though not specifically naming the group, immediately drew the attention and ire of others. One of those engaging with the tweet was John Malin, an artist who had recently worked for Marvel on the cable series and came under fire for comparing SJWs to Nazis. Malin believed SJWs were infecting the comic book industry and forcing creators to comply with their strict view of the world for fear of being called a racist, homophobic, or transphobic. In his eyes, the authoritarians were those that were calling for an end to harmful representation standards and offensive online rhetoric. He claimed no harassment could be blamed on critics like Diversity in Comics because they never explicitly told followers to harass the subjects of their critiques. This ignores the fundamentals of stochastic terrorism and propaganda, but his strong anti-SJW stance made him a darling of the ComicsGate movement. His response to Quesada pointed out that Spider-Gwen co-creator Robbie Rodriguez had recently tweeted a photo. Oh my God, I forgot about this. He had recently tweeted a photo of his anus to Ethan Van Sciver as a means of insulting him. And
okay.
look, that's shitty. You shouldn't do that. And like,
I also
regardless of,
love that's not what I expected.
yeah, for like, for Malin, this act could be used to show the contempt that Marvel held for ComicsGate personalities, because he was like, well, Robbie Rodriguez created Spider-Gwen, and he's out here doing this bullshit to Comicsgaters. But this thought would make sense if the behavior was condoned or perpetrated by a representative of the company. And unfortunately for him, that's not the case. As Quesada pointed out, he agrees that this behavior is not acceptable, but it was also an action taken by someone who had not worked for Marvel in quite some time. So he's like,
Right.
oh, he's trying to blame Marvel for something someone did who at one point worked for them. If an employee had done or said something inappropriate, which he acknowledged had happened, it would be dealt with internally and privately. Alternatively, Malin freely associates with Richard C. Meyer, who is often seen as a leader in the ComicsGate movement and had repeatedly engaged in behavior such as calling female writers he didn't like cum dumpsters, belittling minority creators by suggesting they got their
Cum
jobs
dumpsters back. I haven't heard it in months. Oh God.
He was belittling minority creators by suggesting they got their jobs on no merit other than being a minority, misgendered trans creators, and claimed many of the women in the industry sucked their way to the top. So Meyer's abhorrent actions were well known by this time and vehemently defended, including by Malin himself. Malin was quick to respond by saying Meyer was a critic, and as such, the complaints against him are complaints against criticism. So the behavior in question, that does not constitute criticism, nor does Meyer offer evidence to support his claims. These are personal attacks, ones that strip accomplishments from minorities. Like, that's all it is. Malin both condones and defends those actions. Just by saying, like, he's a critic, so you're arguing against critiques is fucking bullshit.
It's
That
also
doesn't
like it's also the thing of like, I don't think some people understand what actual criticism is. Like, and I had to say, oh my God, man, if I could, I'm not going to spill all my old work drama on this podcast, but uh,
I
like,
think I
I
know
have had to
exactly who
have,
you're talking about, though.
probably, I have had
Yeah.
to have like multiple conversations with people explaining how, like, it's one thing to critique somebody's like work. Like, if
Mhm.
you're gonna like with comic books, if you're gonna say, "Hey, like the writing on this, like the style is very weird. Like I'm not about it," or like I find the pacing of this story to be, you know, really like erratic. That is a
Right.
criticism, and that is a valid criticism. Even if it's like I don't love the artwork of it, like it's subjective, but that is a valid thing of criticism. Um, being like, "Hey, Susan, you're a fucking cum dumpster." That's not criticism. That is nothing related to the work. That is just
Right.
you being a bully. Like, I
Yeah.
and it's so bizarre that, like, people just think, like, "Oh, I can, like, personally insult this person, like, I can call them a bitch, and I can call them, again, a cum dumpster." I'm using it as much as I can because it's
Feel
great.
free.
Or like, "Oh, I'm gonna send somebody my asshole." Like, that's not a criticism.
And
That's just you being insane.
and again, that's from both sides of this argument. That's,
It is, and it's just
and
people
both
are
of them
not
are wrong.
communicating. Exactly.
I can't wait to
It's
I have a surprise for you when we get to the final episode, because I had so
oh, I'm
much fun
so
writing
excited.
it. um and I the reason I wrote so as an FYI, I wasn't finished writing this series when you and I started. So your reaction to Cum Dumpster the first time, I ended up just going through and adding it as soon whenever this guy was mentioned, Cum Dumpster comes up because I was like,
We
it's
just
so fucking
we just sprinkled it in
yeah.
to see if
Well,
Corinne would freak out.
well,
Which is
also
true. I will
it's
every time.
fucking insane that this guy like even did that, like, and it should
It
be
just makes
noted.
me honestly, at this point, because I've started from our 3-month break, I've started watching The Boys, and
Wow.
I'm already watching the 3rd season. We watched the first episode like, the
Mhm.
other night. So I'm not fully up to date, but, like, Cum Dumpster is 100% something I would expect from, like, that show, but only in, like, the work of fiction said by, like, one of the worst, shittiest characters, you know?
Oh,
Like,
I
why does it
and
have to be a thing that someone in real life said?
it is a bonkers thing. And like it's funny. Um but it's all like
But it's also
I'm
like, this person's not, like, in a silly, goofy mood.
right.
They're so genuine about it that it's, like, cringy that that's what they came up with. Oh, it's crazy.
Also, just thinking about like I've not read The Boys nor have I seen the show.
I
I'm
wanna
I'm
read it. The show is bonkers. Like,
I'm the writer is Garth Ennis, and there are a handful of comic book writers that I could easily see just sprinkling Cum Dumpster into their books, and he is one
yeah.
of them. It absolutely checks out.
I do picture it. Like, again, it would be, like, one of, like, the garbage people, like, in that series.
So, I do want to point out, like, so we were talking about like all of these actions and how shitty they are. Um, and the tacit approval that you give by by associating with the people that are like pretty well known for doing this and not at all apologetic. Like again, Richard C. Meyer with Cum Dumpster and all that.
Yeah.
A year after Malin had this argument with Joe Quesada online, he joined a live stream with both Ethan Van Sciver and Richard C. Meyer. And I listened to this thinking like, I just want to see where he's coming from a year after this, right? I
Mhm.
I had boy was I not fucking prepared because Meyer immediately claimed Zoe Quinn and others like them forced their opponents into suicide through their use of Twitter. He expanded on this to say that they want to hear about your wife and kids crying at your funeral and that these are the worst people the human race has ever produced. Van Sciver responded by saying that while this sounds like an exaggeration, it absolutely is not. So, this is the rhetoric that Malin tacitly approves by continuing to associate with Meyer and Ethan Van Sciver and by defending his actions as normal criticism.
This
Quinn's
is
life
insane.
be- Quinn's life became a series of harassment lobbed at them online, and Meyer chose to use this specific person as an example of the exact fucking opposite. The acknowledgement that social interactions
Yeah.
online that are abusive can cause mental anguish and can lead to real world harm is an acknowledgement that Meyer understands his own fucking responsibility and the consequences of his fucking actions. He
And, oh,
is
this sucks. Like,
inciting this shit.
their life was probably just, like, coming down from Gamergate, I would hope,
Ugh,
and then, like, he probably just, like, ramped it back up for them, and that is upsetting. Like, they've been through enough. Leave them
I
be.
I don't want to like overhype the last episode because I don't want it to be such a big letdown. But I literally, when I wrote the final paragraph for the final episode of this particular series, I had to physically restrain myself from texting you how excited I was about a thing. And it's you're there's gonna be some payoff
My
here.
gremlin laugh is coming out.
uh, so and it's related because I'm gonna tie all of this shit together. You're gonna have fun with it, okay?
It's gonna be in a this cum dumpster is gonna close in a beautiful Christmas bow.
So, the use of misleading or outright fictional claims about the comic book industry serves the ComicsGate movement well, right? It's, of course, if you're harassing people online and you're looking for cover, it's great if you can have someone just fucking lie for you. So for Meyer to defend his and his followers' actions, the victims of their abuse would need to seem like a far greater threat so that the harassment could be seen as justified, right? So if someone is like a huge asshole to you online and you're just kind of fighting back, that would play well. It would make you seem like less of a huge dick. So
Mhm.
similarly, any emotional turmoil from online interactions has to be one-sided, with ComicsGate as the victim. And perhaps most importantly, information would need to be presented in such a way that confirms ComicsGate's belief system. Some of the best sources for all of this were alternative news sites that cater to ComicsGate narratives, such as Bleeding Fool and Bounding into Comics, or comicsgate.org. And oh boy, this is where I got real fucking angry. I thought this was going to be a couple of paragraphs and it turned into several pages.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The comic book news and gossip site Bleeding Fool, which parodies a similar site by the name of Bleeding Cool, helps to offer alternative information for anti-SJW and identity politics groups. So, Bleeding Cool, for anyone that doesn't know, it's kind of a garbage site, but it's fine. It's just a guy who runs the site and he talks a lot about comics. He does a lot of like just rumor based stuff. But it's fine for what it is. A lot of people go there because it's a good way to just kind of like find out behind the scenes stuff. Because
Right.
he'll post whatever. He doesn't give a shit. Um, Jameson Ashley, the founder of Bleeding Fool, recalled the origins of his site by stating, quote, "One day I was on the Bleeding Cool message boards commenting on a story they were running where the writer was praising the forced diversity of one of that month's inclusive comics du jour. And I posted that I thought, while it was commendable that X-Men 94, published in 1975, and which introduced many of the most well-known X-Men, was extremely diverse, Marvel didn't feel a need to promote it as a diverse comic book. They just told a solid story, and it became a hit. I was shadow banned by Bleeding Cool within an hour of making that comment. That was the day Bleeding Fool was born, and it would allow people to sound off without fear of being censored for a wrong think." So, the point that Ashley is trying to make is that during the marketing for Uncanny X-Men 94, Marvel's marketing did not focus on the ethnic backgrounds of the main characters. And the reason
Right.
he chose this particular issue is because it is the first one printed with what has been labeled the all new, all different team by the company after their successful introduction in Giant Size X-Men #1. So if you
Mhm.
go into reading X-Men, you kind of have the original team of like Beast, Angel, Jean Grey, Iceman, and someone I'm sure I missed. You have the original five, um,
Right.
and they are predominantly white, predominantly male, and up until recently, all straight.
Right.
Then in the 70s, Marvel decided to publish Giant Size X-Men #1. And that's when you get Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, these characters from different countries with different ethnic backgrounds. And that was
Okay,
labeled
cool.
all new, all different. That's what he's talking about here, right? And he's saying that the Marvel did not decide to focus on the ethnic backgrounds of the character when they were promoting the book. So um, X-Men was a strange series that floundered for a while. We kind of talked about that and nearly fell off
Right.
completely until that particular team was introduced. And with this group of characters and longtime scribe Chris Claremont at the helm, X-Men became the top-selling book and a juggernaut of a franchise, all of which came about when Marvel was looking to diversify its lineup. So marketing materials may not have played up the diversity as much as Ashley thinks, but the decision, based on appealing to a broader audience, was definitely there. And you have to also keep in mind, they labeled the team all new, all different.
I was just
It's not.
about to say, like, it just because it doesn't explicitly say diversity, that, like, all new, all different is definitely like all new people, all new different kinds of people. Like,
Right.
that's just a long way of saying diverse series. Like,
Right. The claim that mentioned by Ashley that they were shadow banned by Bleeding Cool is plausible. I mean, I have no idea if that's true. The site itself hadn't really been known for many accusations of doing that, but they are kind of known for weird the business decisions and a few ethical practices there of too, including the decision to interview and platform Vox Day, something that Ethan Van Sciver did. We talked about that. Um,
Yeah.
that's something that they did on that website as well. And though popular, Bleeding Cool was never seen as a mainstream source of journalism. Like whether or not his specific comment was the deciding factor is nearly impossible to ascertain, but ultimately irrelevant in the grand scheme of how comic book reporting is handled by mainstream outlets. It's
Mhm.
like so um it's not a mainstream source of news. That's what I really want to get at. They even apologized for having Vox Day on their site, right? Um,
Right.
but they did it to just talk about comic books. It's the same thing Ethan Van Sciver did. It's it's not the same as like going on CNN. You know what I mean? It's kind of like going to
Yeah, the
your
reach
friend's
is a
blog.
little different.
Right. Whether or not any of that happened, it doesn't really matter. Ashley's offense led him to building a news and gossip website specifically for conservative base that opposes what they deemed a liberal bias. He went so far as to copy Bleeding Cool's own logo and changed the title to Bleeding Fool. It is literally the exact same logo. He just switched out the letters. So this
Oh.
this would be the site dedicated to showing the leftist nature of comic book media. That's their fucking goal. In actuality, the content published by the site is often contrarian for seemingly no fucking purpose at all, or filled with homophobia so thinly veiled it might as well be a window. The bias in their writing is on full display, proudly touted as a reason for their own existence. From their website, quote, while poking a bit of fun at some of the more highly revered comic book websites, we've decided it's time to respond to either their boring, unbiased reporting with something a bit more nuanced and interesting, or respond to their decidedly progressive liberal politics with opinions from the libertarian and closer to the right side of the aisle. Sometimes things may get a bit extreme, but we always welcome diversity of ideas here, and anyone with a free Discus account is welcome to push back or sound off in the comments section as long as they're not a name calling jerk. So, a quick scroll through their contributors showcases several high profile names and troubling histories, like Ethan Van Sciver, Avi Green, and even Breitbart are all promoted contributors in some capacity. For Breitbart,
Yeah.
most of those articles are attributed to them are they're actually just repostings from their own site by different authors. So someone went through and just took a Breitbart article and posted it on Bleeding Fool. That's that's how Breitbart is shown as a contributing
This
person.
very much gives me Rhino vibes, like Republican in name only, when it's like,
Yes.
"Oh, like, like, I'm just a Republican, but, like, only by, like, my title. I'm, like, super chill and cool." And then, like, you see, like, the politicians that are, like, advertising themselves as rhinos, and then they're still just like, "We heavily support the police, and, like, we are pushing all of the liberals out of here." And it's just like, "Oh, you're still a little elephant. You're not different."
And when you go through the site, like I said, you get Breitbart on there. If you look at Ethan Van Sciver, like his name is listed, but no actual article ever seems to have been written by him. Or at the
Right.
very least, those articles have been removed. Like if you click on him, nothing's there. But he's a promoted contributor. So other authors have a
Okay.
varied history. I mean, I don't know. It could be just weird, like coding. I have no fucking idea. But
Yeah, I
like
don't know. Go off, I guess. I'm
other
not gonna
authors
go to
have
your website.
they have a varied history, with some posting very matter of fact pieces about interesting comic
Mhm.
news, such as Christina Wiggins coverage their coverage of a Disney Plus episode that highlighted a young transgender girl and its ties to charity. The comments on this article alone decry transgenderism as a death style, as opposed to a lifestyle. Get it? Claim Walt Disney was a pedophile and label the entire episode sick or child abuse. The audience cultivated by Bleeding Fool rarely shows a dissenting opinion, but instead creates an environment for a bubble of extremism. Which brings me to another author who I found in my research of this. We're going to talk about a man named Avi Green. Avi Green adds
Okay.
directly to this hyperbolic writing and paints an interesting portrait. In fact, a great deal can be learned about what Bleeding Fool deems appropriate by their association with Green and the causes he fights both for and against.
Okay.
Decrying what he considers far left and woke politics in the media, a common fixation seems to be his obsession with LGBTQ plus stories. In his article on PBS Kids TV show Arthur, Green blames the cancellation of the long-running series on a 2019 episode featuring a wedding between two men. According to Green, the series drifted too far into leftist politics by featuring gay characters, much like the spin-off show had an episode with two lesbian women before its cancellation. Green also ties this to The Simpsons recently having Mr. Smithers come out as gay and questions how long that show will remain on the air. So this led me to wondering, what would pop up if I just searched the term homosexual on Bleeding Fool? And oh
Yeah.
boy, I found article after article written by various contributors, but most predominantly by Avi Green, with the general consensus being that whatever gay character is introduced or portrayed is bad. For instance, in an article about one of Batman's Robins coming out as bisexual, Green argues that the political left is promoting homosexuality the same way Nazis promoted the Aryan race.
Oh my
So,
god.
this implies that
No.
the political left, or those okay with printing LGBTQ plus characters, are fucking Nazis. So in another post on his own blog, Green espouses, quote, "First, I think it did cause harm in the long run to censor homosexuality as much as sex scenes in general for as long as it happened in the Silver Age. Mainly because how would it be possible for anybody who disapproves of abnormalities to comment on how and why they feel it's a bad influence?" So this type of rhetoric, which paints homosexuality in an almost entirely negative light, is not reserved exclusively for expressions of sexuality. Green writes about transgenderism often with the claim that there's no chance they would ever depict transgender ideology negatively or as a poor example. So for him, biological sex is the only thing worth acknowledging, as he will frequently misgender characters and even refer to them as scientific and chemical experiments. The mere
Oh.
existence of transgender characters, he believes, is entirely part of a leftist plot, and acknowledgement of their preferred pronouns is a purely leftist media push. You can't just acknowledge that these people exist if you are anything to the right of the extreme left, according to him.
Ugh.
And
This man gives me the ick. I just don't like him. Like, why
uh,
can't you just leave other people's agendas alone? Like, why?
he also went on to assert, quote, "It's degrading to women to make it look like non-binary is a mentality that they should emulate. And come to think of it, to men as well. Not to mention that the culture of cutting away the hair on the sides to look vaguely like a mohawk is denigrating as well." This is in 2018 that this man wrote this. I don't understand the fucking fascination with fucking haircuts.
This man is clearly just writing blogs of, like, "I don't think this is cute." Like, "I don't think
Yes.
this" like, "I'm not attracted to this," but trying to make it an article that sounds smart. But if anything, it just sounds dumb as hell. This man's
Yeah.
dumb.
He frequently refers to non-heteronormative or cisgender people as having a mental disorder, and anyone that discusses what it is like or how it is portrayed is merely pushing identity politics. Again, to him, you cannot acknowledge that these people exist. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice to society. And this, of course, obscures the fact that transgender biology is a fact with phenotypic expressions evident and a much wider expression of gender identity, even on a genetic level, regularly observed.
Yeah.
Avi Green's obsession with homosexuality, expressions of gender, and its positive portrayal in the media goes back a long way. In 2006, Green wrote a blog post titled, "They Want Us to Tolerate the Abnormal, the Perverse, the Sick," in which he discusses a character coming out as gay and state that this makes them mentally ill. Following that assertion, he claims that if any dare voice an objection to homosexuality as anything other than acceptable, they would be smeared as a fascist before declaring his disgust for what he sees as a character destruction. Green's anger at any and all things gay is not the only defining characteristic of his writing, nor the writing at Bleeding Fool. Further into his rant on homosexuality, Green writes, quote, "This is but part of the creeping homosexualization of comic books, and it's really insulting. Mainly because it's never depicted as a problem and probably not even asked, if at all. We're just supposed to accept it, regardless of whether it's sane or not. And what's next? Will Islam be presented in comics as the next thing we're told to tolerate and accept, regardless of what it's like?" So, of course, Green and other writers at Bleeding Fool have dedicated a great deal of time defining, decrying, and defiling Islam. When discussing Marvel Comics editor Sana Amanat, who worked on Ms. Marvel,
Yeah.
Green focused almost exclusively on her religious background. Upon learning that she was related to Huma Abedin, former deputy chief of staff to Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of
Mhm.
State, Green immediately asserts that her work at Marvel was leftist propaganda, just because they were related. So while discussing Abedin's ties to the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, Green points to an article from WorldNet Daily that states that this is a journal promoting Sharia law. If anyone shows you anything from WorldNet Daily, just fucking slap them and walk away. So that specific claim, this is a conspiracy theory that had long since been debunked at the time of Green's post. The idea that Abedin had ties to the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs and that it was a journal that was promoting Sharia law. That's not true. Well,
This
not in
all
the way
sounds
that
insane, yeah.
Abedin was tangentially tied to the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. The publication was considered a sober academic journal with differing views on what it is like to be a Muslim in various areas around the world. So it had nothing to do with anything that he was saying it did. The need for Abedin to be seen as radically in favor of Sharia law only served the purpose of scaring Islamophobes and riling a conservative base against the Democratic Party. Green's
Mm.
use of his long since debunked conspiracy points to his lax journalistic integrity and extreme religious and political bias. The truth did not matter, but the optics of the situation allowed him to tie Sana Amanat to someone accused of religious tyranny and thus accuse Marvel of a similar conspiracy. The
Okay.
mere existence of Muslim creators or characters is enough to draw the ire of like a lot of their readers, right?
Mhm.
The comic book Yasmin, published through Scout Comics, earned the title of Islamic propaganda for simply having a Muslim character and not explicitly stating that some terrible things have happened in the name of religion. So the idea is like if you have a Christian character, it
Yeah.
is it is Christian propaganda if you don't talk about the fucking Crusades, according to this logic. it,
Yeah,
it,
like, I think people are forgetting that, like, any human being can be violent. Like, you don't I can't believe I have to say this to the world, but, like, not every person who practices it, you know, Islam is violent. And, like, there are some Christians that are fucking violent. Like, it goes both ways. Like, people are just people, and, like, existing, and everybody is such, like, a pure individual. Like, you can't just pinpoint and
it for
just
for
make it a
people
whole blatant statement.
for people who have this thought process, it's also not, you're not allowed to think differently. Like, Richard C. Meyer
Yeah,
gave a positive review to that specific comic book, Yasmin, and it brought immediate and immense pushback from Avi Green, who claimed that Meyer was being naive. The comic tells the story of a 16-year-old girl who survived 2 years of slavery under ISIS and must deal with establishing a new normalcy after this traumatic event while starting a life in America. To
yeah.
Green, the comic is only propaganda that supports the actions of ISIS by simply having Islam as part of the main character's background. It doesn't matter that the abduction and slavery are portrayed as horrific because he views having a Muslim character the same as promoting that religion and therefore the extremist actions of any of their religious zealots.
Yeah, this guy's
Even
insane. Like,
even the
I picture like, okay, so the book Carrie, I just picture him being raised like Carrie was. Just, like,
yeah,
getting locked in a closet whenever she did, like, something minorly wrong. Like, because like, the things that he is saying and coming up with are just, like, it's too much. Like, it's way too much.
it's a he went further to say the term Islamophobia is it's actually a badge of honor for anyone who's a realist.
That's
Like, that's where
stupid.
he's coming from. It's
That's
it
so stupid. This man is dumb.
So while the majority of the posts on Bleeding Fools specific to Islam are written by Avi Green, he is not the sole source of that content. And for instance,
Right.
Alexander Adams, a defender of ComicsGate, not necessarily part of ComicsGate, but someone who like very, very much stood in to defend ComicsGate, was
Mhm.
interviewed by Bleeding Fools founder on how the movement was a reaction to cultural entryism, a term that is defined, or he defined anyway, as the use of art as a social tool. In his view, the media is being used to carefully craft a narrative that promotes a particular ideology, and Comicsgate is the most abundantly documented case of such an event. Interestingly, Adams also points to the massacre of the Charlie Hebdo staff as the moment he became interested in the impact of politics and culture. The incident that he is referring to is when I don't know if you remember this at all. The Charlie Hebdo incident?
Not No, I don't think I do.
All right. I wrote it in here because I was like, most people are probably not going to remember this. It stood out to me, I think, because of my particular interests. The incident is when two French Muslim brothers from the Islamic terrorist group Al Qaeda forced their way into the Charlie Hebdo offices and killed 12 people. The motive of the attack is largely believed to be the magazine's controversial depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. The incident that Alexander Adams uses as the defining moment for his interest in politics is a terrorist attack carried out by two Muslim extremists, and then goes on to argue that all of culture is trying to make you okay with other cultures. And it
Okay.
he just got radicalized is all I'm trying. Yeah. He dives a
Yeah.
bit deeper into his views on Islam in his book Culture War: Art, Identity, Politics, and Cultural Entryism by dedicating a large chunk on religious extremism and specifically how Muslim extremists force censorship on the West. Adams claims a focus on identity politics and a perceived double standard when it comes to anti religious sentiment and hate speech as strengthening the agenda of Western Islamicists. Or, I'm sorry, Islamists. That's how he wrote it. The
Okay.
idea is that the principle of identity politics breed a victimhood narrative that undermines Western society. And this is all part of the leftists' Marxist agenda, which is co opted by Islamic extremists. I want to just take a moment here. Everything he is saying goes back to a ton of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's just he's tying it
Yeah.
to is Islam. It's what he's talking about here. This Marxist bullshit, cultural Marxism. It comes
Right.
from a huge bunch of actually things that came out of Gamergate. I
Okay.
forget. It's something that like Alex Jones latched onto. All of
Yes.
these fucking assholes, and it's all so thoroughly and easily debunked. And the way so many of these conspiracy theorists sort of craft it and make it new is they go, well, okay, yeah, that stuff's wrong, but this stuff is right. Like that other thing, that was stupid. But this just
Yeah.
happens to be the exact same thing, and it's about a different group. Don't worry about it. It's
Man, it's just this is just a bunch of people that are just scared of anything that isn't similar to them, and it's just, like, cringy.
he go he, so he in his book stated, this is a quote from him, okay? The leftist sees anti-colonialism as the goal. The Islamist sees anti-colonialism as a stage in a process towards establishing a Eurasian or worldwide caliphate. The leftist's secular outlook prevent him from understanding the depth of feeling the Islamist has and the literalness of the Islamist's stated beliefs. For the leftists, there is comfort in the belief that the real enemies of peace and prosperity are capitalism and Western democracy. So strong is their attachment to the victim narrative. So, repeatedly, Adams and others within ComicsGate refuse to acknowledge the inherent socioeconomic differences between races within our society. Focusing on representation within media or the struggles of the underserved minorities is seen as a weakness and portraying a victimhood that others must accommodate. This tactic is the same as similar ones used during the era of Gamergate. While
Yeah.
ComicsGate and Gamergate proponents claim to be tragically oppressed by perceived grievances, opposing views showing the plight of minorities and historical complications are downplayed as whining about being a victim. The same idea can be traced to the defensiveness with which the groups interact with criticism. And that is really like what I want to get at here, because this is kind of how I got down this rabbit hole. Was I was trying to
Yeah.
talk about the news sites, and I wanted to talk about like how they use this as a defense, and then I found all of this other shit. I
Right.
I want to point out to like the reason I spent so much time talking about that particular author and his book, Culture
Mhm.
War, Art, Identity, Politics, and Cultural Entryism. I found his book and I was reading through it when I was researching this particular episode.
Right.
And then I found that he was interviewed by ComicsGate. I like
Oh,
at
wow.
at the exact same time, I was like, wow, this guy has some crazy thoughts. And he wrote an entire chapter on ComicsGate. And I was like,
Right.
oh, that's interesting. I wanted to see what opposing views there were. And boy, like, I mean, there's some interesting stuff in there, but it's uh, wildly out of context or a bit tone deaf. Um,
Yeah, like, especially, like, I there was a part where he's talking about, like, he's afraid of, like, losing Western culture or, like, the downfall of Western culture, and it's like, I don't think you understand, like, how infectious Western culture is. Like,
yes.
we have taken over so much shit, like, so much shit. So, is it really, like, that bad if, like, we learn something from other
Also,
people?
let's
It's
talk. You're talking about like Western culture and how we're gonna lose our sense of self. We're gonna lose like whiteness. That's what they mean when they say Western culture. Generally speaking, they mean
yeah,
white, right? So, all right. In Western culture, we have rock and roll, hip hop. We took those from the Black community, right? Is that not Western culture? Because it didn't really necessarily come from us, if that's what you mean
yeah,
by Western culture. We also have like the same people arguing about your losing your culture, and it's this whole thing are the same ones who are like, well, I should be allowed to dress up as like a Native American for Halloween, or I should, I get to use someone else's culture as a costume, as something that is to be discarded when I don't want it. But how dare you come for mine by just saying, hey, there's some problematic fucking elements to it.
Yeah, like, there's not a lot there's, like, a lot of little things that you can change,
Yeah.
like, to be a better person, to be a better ally, to just improve, and overall, that still does not really it's not that it's not as much of an inconvenience as people think it is, like, it's not even an inconvenience. It's
Yeah.
like, maybe just change a phrasing on something every once in a while, and maybe you'll find a word you like better, like a far more fun word that nobody's offended by. Or, like, you know, maybe instead of appropriating, like, you can actually be fucking creative and maybe come up with a cooler costume. Like, it's not hard. If anything, it's more fun to just be nice to everybody. 'Cause then you can, like, you can just use your brain for so much more. Like
The idea of someone being like, hey, um it would be really nice if you spoke to me this particular way, or you referred to me as in this particular way, or anything like that. The idea of that being something that is immediately responded to with vitriol and anger is wild to me, because it's as simple as one person being like, hey, I would really like it if you did this because otherwise I'm sad. Or, like,
yeah.
if you make it a very, very simple concept like that, and then your response is "fuck you," yeah, no,
Like,
you're the asshole in this situation.
I've had friends change names, like, multiple times, and,
Mhm.
like, that's fine. The most I have to do is change a contact name. That's it. That takes 5 minutes. Not even 5 minutes. That takes 5 seconds. And then after that, I just read the contact information, and then I'm like, "Oh, it's this person. I know who this person is."
Mhm.
And now it's
Mhm.
even easier to remember their name because I've immediately updated the contact information, which took 5 seconds. Literally, like, it is so not even close to it's the most convenient. Like, it's so easy to update yourself now. Like,
And if you make a mistake, most people are not going to be upset with you. There, as
no.
long as you're not like continuing to make the mistake, because then it's like, all
As
right,
long as you're just making, like, literally some of an effort to
yeah,
try and be a nice person,
the
which
fucking
again,
easiest thing on the planet.
doesn't take much. Like, you don't have to have money to be nice.
Great. It, these people are refusing to acknowledge their particular role in society, and they have to defend
Yeah,
themselves, right? The idea of using these websites and these particular writers as a defense and as a cover for how they interact with others is something that I think really should be well understood. Um,
yeah.
Abraham Reisman or Reisman, I'm not quite sure. I I apologize. However, I'm sure I am getting everyone's names wrong. But this particular person, they pointed out, quote, in angry tweets as well as rambling YouTube videos, members of the ComicsGate movement have derided female and minority characters, creators, and fans, all while claiming to want a return to an imagined past of apolitical comics. Many of them have special ire for trans people. SJW Mags Visaggio takes advantage of trans Tinder privilege to get hired and make money, which was misspelled, and they put that in there. I love that. That read the title of one of Meyer's videos about trans writer Magdalene Visaggio, accusing them of faking their trans status for fame and profit. Because, of course, the easiest thing to do in the world is to take on the role of probably the most harassed people on the planet in order
Yeah.
to make a little bit of extra money, but anyway, he goes on. A Comicsgate news hub called Bounding into Comics emerged, where progressive creators and critics are regularly accused of harassing or silencing conservatives. For those who followed Gamergate, the defensive positions are all too familiar. Whenever someone says something extreme or incites targeted harassment, other reactionaries will either say it was all a joke or that the person doesn't represent the larger movement. So this happens over and over and over, and
Yeah.
what you get is people who say, "Oh, that was a joke. You don't understand. That person may have meant it, but they don't take." But it's so many of them. Like you're fostering this environment.
Yeah, it's like
The other
everybody's using the same excuse.
the other thing is you get people who, like, if you hound someone for long enough and they snap back, all it takes is that one tweet, that one whatever, for them to use, like, look, this is the reason I am allowed to harass this person because they were mean to me this one time. And if you have this news site and they are constantly talking about the one time someone did something bad,
Mhm.
then that's your cover for treating them like shit, you know?
Yeah, it's like why people make fun of the Kardashians all the time. It's like, "Oh, well, they're rich, and once a month they say something stupid, so I can obliterate them every day."
Right.
Like, man, people spend their energy on real dumb things. Like I
Oh
don't
yeah.
love the Kardashians, but, like, I also spend very little time thinking about them
Same.
because I don't like them. Why would I put that in my life? Oh, people are so dumb.
The game that is played begins when a ComicsGate follower harasses someone online. That's kind of like what I was talking about before. Like as soon as they snap back, they're able to go like, "Hey, this is the thing." This
Yeah,
like that gives them the opportunity to say, "I'm allowed to treat this person this way." And when you compound that feeling with a sense of victimhood, while claiming that the opposing side sees themselves as the victim, that's their recipe for recruitment. That's how you get more people involved. The feedback
yeah.
loop that is established tricks enough people to follow further down the rabbit hole and be radicalized by the movement. Alexander Adams correctly defined this phenomenon in his own book. Extremists cannot be accommodated. This is a quote, by the way.
Mhm.
Extremists cannot be accommodated within a secular society by way of reasonable concessions because extremism is essentially unreasonable in that it rests on belief, not reason. An extremist can never be satisfied because he lives in a perpetual state of discontent and anger. He abhors doubt and seeks to eradicate it. Every day, he is constantly provoked by his failure to remake reality. Interestingly, though, this particular passage is actually about the Islamic extremists that he has built much of his political interests around. But if you really just, if you, all I did was I took out any reference to religion in that. And he is
Yeah.
describing Comicsgate.
Yeah.
So, it,
He gotta look
ugh.
in the mirror.
So that's really kind of uh that's it for this episode. This is a long episode. We're gonna take a look at some of the more wild events from Comicsgate next time, including
Oh,
mo-
boy.
more lawsuits, some of publishing allies, QAnon ties, and an announced partnership with one of the most problematic figures in Comicsgate. Um, we're gonna talk about all that coming up. I'm very excited about it. And you know what I just realized right now?
Oh, no, what is it?
I never asked you what your bright spot was. I wanted to
Oh
start
my
the episode that way.
god! We can finish with it, it'll be so
Yes.
fun. Oh, boy. I have so many. I've got, like, a little disco ball, it's very fun. Today in and of itself was great. One, because we're back to recording, but also, Max and I, my boyfriend and I, we went on, like, a huge hike, um, and I didn't get to go on, like, any hikes last year, but I love them, so I finally have them back. We went on a huge hike, hung around, like, a fun little main street and, like, got coffee, and then we got a ton done in the apartment. Like, I have my new ladder shelf and, like, a new lamp. So I'm gonna, like,
Awesome.
basically just, like, redecorate everything today, which is
Mhm.
very fun and exciting. Um, Also, I've just been reading a lot, which is great. Like, I'll go in between, like, novels to then comic books, and I just keep bouncing back because I don't like to read things consecutively or else I'll get tired of a style.
I do the
Um,
same thing.
yeah. So, like, I finished Frankenstein and then I read Bottom Feeder, um,
Ooh.
which, like, made
Oh,
me
that
think.
Bottom
Like,
Feeder?
we'll have to talk about it because, like,
Oh, yeah.
the
It's a
shit,
great comic.
it my brain was active when I was reading it. It was wild.
I read that in an afternoon when I was sick, and
I read
I
it in one night and, like,
yeah.
I shouldn't have read it at night, and it's not because, like, it's good, like, it I like the horror elements of it. It wasn't the
Mhm.
horror that made me, like, not be able to sleep, it was just all of the metaphors and, like, what it was talking about, and I was like, "Damn, I gotta think about some things."
So
Um,
for anyone that has never heard of Bottom Feeders, it's a book about
it's about
uh
gentrification in Chicago.
gentrification. Yeah. Yes.
And they mix
It's
it with, like, this kind of, like, body horror, but it's not like, it's almost like The Blob and, like,
yeah.
The Thing mixed with, like, gentrification in Chicago. It's so fascinating. And, like,
It's really good.
I grew up, like, around Philly, and the people who, like, designed it and wrote it are from Philly. So I was just like,
Mhm.
"Oh my god, like, it's everywhere." Um, so that was just fascinating, and then I can't remember what I think I read, like, a James Patterson book in between that because I was like, "I need something that's mindless and isn't gonna make me, like, question life itself." Um,
Right.
it is a beautiful book, by the way. It's like the art is so cool and neat.
Mm.
But then I read Seconds, which was, like, that
Ooh,
Scott Pilgrim, like, style
Brian
one.
Brian Lee O'Malley. Yeah. It's,
Yeah, that
the
was
same
super
guy.
neat. Yes, that one was super fun and neat, and I liked it. The ending, I was, like, a little nervous in the middle. I was like, "Oh, no." I was worried
Yeah.
about her. And then and then the ending was good. I was like, "Okay, good. She learned her lesson. I'm very happy for her." Yeah, and then what am I reading now? Now I'm reading The Alchemist, and I'm almost done. It's, like, a pretty quick read. I just keep, like,
Mm.
not picking it up because it's, like it's always in a bag, and then I
Mhm.
forget where the bag is,
Yeah, yeah.
so then I just forget to read. Um, yeah, so that's been a thing, it's been great. I think next I don't know what I'm gonna read next because I picked up so many, like, comic books of my own, like, so it's like, I gotta read some of mine, but I also have to read some of yours so I can return them to you.
Oh, you keep
Um,
mine as long as you want. Well, as long as I I have missed out on so many books because I lend them out and then people just keep them. And I'm fully prepared for that. So
oh, no,
just read
they're all separate, they're all in a stack on our entertainment center. So I remember whose is whose, and then I just kind of turn it into 2 piles of, like, these are the ones I've read and these are the ones I haven't read. So they will 100% come back to you, also because I frequent your house, so
yeah.
they will come back, it's fine.
Wait, I'm curious. What comics did you buy recently? If you don't
Okay,
mind
so
me
I
asking.
oh, no, I'm super excited. I'm excited about all of them. I think I mentioned that I do have the White Knight series, so I'm gonna read that,
Oh yeah.
and then I do have the Harley Quinn spin-off of that, which I'm excited about. That's one of those where I bought, like, a 1 issue, and
Mhm.
then I was like, "Oh, I want the whole book." Great reason to buy 1 issues. Um, but then what did I get at the on Free Comic Book Day? I got the Saga stuff. I got, like, Bloodstained Teeth. I got the first issue of that, and I'm
Mhm.
really excited to read it. And then I bought the first book of Sandman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I
I'm
I
excited
have
about it.
I have a good chunk of those. I don't have the whole series in part because I have lent it out to people and they've kept it. But
Yeah.
uh
Well,
that is
I
usually
had to buy this one because the whole cover is, like, it's this guy, and then it's a shit ton of cats, and I was like, "This book is for me." Like, I have to have it.
there's
So
there's a single issue of Sandman that you can read entirely separated from the rest of it. I'll find which one
Mhm.
it is, but it's entirely about cats. So
Yes.
I got to remember what issue number it is. I'll look it up when we're off of this and I'll tell you, because you can literally, I probably have that particular book here. It's
You might. It might just
interesting.
be a different art, like, or different cover or something.
Yeah, it's a different kind of story. It's not one that I was super into, but it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But entire, like, cats are the entire cast. That's it.
Good. That's all I want.
It's
That is
great.
what I love. But yeah, that's kind of the main thing for books. Oh, I did buy, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I got more issues of the Birds of Prey
Oh yeah.
series that I'm reading. So that was good. I haven't read them yet, but they are good. They're fun. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much that's it mostly.
That sounds so much fun. I've been picking up just random stuff. Not even going to the comic book store because it's so far out of my way. I'm driving. I don't know if I've mentioned I drive an hour to work now.
Yes, I
it's
do
gonna be
remember this.
it's gonna be switching soon, but it's so it's a little difficult for me to be like, oh, I'm just gonna make a quick jaunt over to the store.
Yeah,
But I'll just find random stuff online and be like, you know what, I'm kind of interested in that. I'm gonna pick this up. I'm gonna read this. But when we went for free comic book day, I
very
took a
fun.
quick look around. And yeah, and like meeting some of the artists for the first time and buying. I bought a couple of issues of oh, I'm trying to find it now actually. Hold on.
Oh, it's
Let me
like the
see if I
one
can.
with the animals, right?
Yeah, it's like a samurai story. Hold on, I'm gonna give this person a
Yeah.
plug. Let me just find it. Because I read through it and it's a lot of fun. It's a very indie creator. Um, it is
Oh
called
yeah, and I'm always
47.
reading Saga, so there's that too. I forgot about that.
This book is
I didn't
called
mention it in this episode.
47 Furious Tales. She told me how to pronounce her name, and I'm gonna screw it up. It's Alexia Wildhausen. If you
That
look up
sounded pretty
47,
good.
if you look up 47 Furious Tales, I think you'll find it. So Alexia does the artwork. W.S. Quinton does the writing on it. It is really interesting. It's a lot of like animal characters, just kind of living their little samurai lives. It was so much fun to read through. So I highly recommend, if you can find it out there in the world. You probably just have to look up the artist to find it because I'm not sure where to get it.
Yeah.
I also picked up the Electric Black. I don't think I've read that just yet, but it looks really cool. And a bunch of like Bunny Mask, and some of the newer Buffy stuff, which I'm not. I don't know. I think I reached a point where I'm like, I'm kind of done with Buffy. Not because it's not good, but because it's like I got to an ending point where I'm happy. You know?
Yeah, I think that's
So
fair.
I'm gonna move on to something else.
Cool.
Uh, that's awesome though. I'm so happy about all of these. I'm glad that we're both getting out there and expanding our little
Yeah, I'm
libraries.
excited that I'm, like, starting to figure out, like, what I like to read and, like, things like that, and there's still, like, a ton of stuff at home that it's, like, we share collectively.
Hmm.
Like, I'm gonna read some of, like, Max's stuff that he's had. Um, there's, like, a John Constantine book that I really wanna read. He has, like, Hellblazer, I think that's the one it's called. So
I
I've
have
been
a
wanting to
couple of
read that.
those too. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the first one, so I wanna read that really bad, because
If you
I
finish
we
that and you
watched
want the second volume, I have it. If you want to
oh,
just take it.
sweet. Yeah, we watched the John Constantine movie, like, with Keanu Reeves, and, like,
Oh,
I
it's so much
loved
fun.
it. I had the best time.
I do want to make a real quick announcement. I have entirely redone the website. I'll be adding stuff as we
Yay!
go through, including pictures of our guests, assuming that they um, want to,
I have to fill out
and
my
like
form, I forgot.
brief little bio. You're totally fine. And brief little bios, things like that. I have a lot of stuff I'm going to be posting on there, including all of the references for like today's episode. I also I took out the Patreon link. I'm no longer doing Patreon. Instead, I'm doing the like buy me a cup of coffee thing. So you can literally send me 5 cents if you want, or $5, whatever. I don't care. And it doesn't matter. It really would only go to covering the cost of producing the show / like giving any money to like Corinne for being on the show.
Oh, well,
I even designed
just
a
recommend
couple
me
of
more books. You don't have to pay me.
I even designed a couple of t-shirts based off of some things that Corinne has said. So those are going to be up as well. You can find them just by like you can find all of this information, including all of the sources, at comicallypedantic.com, the website I just redid. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram by searching at PedanticCast and at Derek L. Chase on both platforms. New episodes will be coming out on Sundays on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and at comicallypedantic.com. Once we wrap up this thing, I'm going to just probably do one real quick silly episode about a character I really like, one of my favorite Batman villains that no one really knows about or talks about.
I'm so excited about it.
Outside of comic book nerds, anyway. You can support the show by buying me a cup of coffee at comicallypedantic.com. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them in text or audio recordings to comicallypedantic@gmail.com. Again, I do like update this show very sporadically. Usually it's like once or twice a year with like a bunch of episodes all at once, or like within a short period of time. You're welcome to send me any of those, and I can just do an entire episode of answering questions and stuff. And I'm sure Corinne would love to come on too.
I'll come on whenever.
Please
just
indicate if you'd like
know
your
when.
name or question read on the air, just so that I know. And I appreciate you doing this again. Before we started recording, I did let Corinne know I was having some anxiety about whether or not I was forcing her to do this.
Oh, I have a hoot and a half every time, let me tell you.
I'm so happy because I very much enjoy talking to you.
Oh, same. That's why we're friends.
We will be back soon with another deep dive into the culture of comics. But until then, you can find more exciting adventures at your local comic shop.